The mathematics wanted to flow in a certain direction, but your framework was trying to channel it differently. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a child genius challenged one of the most prestigious professors at Harvard University? When a 12-year-old black boy who can't even sit down because of a painful injury walks into a high-level mathematics symposium, no one expects him to change the course of mathematical history. But what happens when this child sees a solution that has stumped experts for months? Why does he stand at the back of every classroom, and what secret pain is he hiding? Witness the extraordinary moment when Elijah Washington raises his hand in a room full of mathematical elites, and prepare to have your heart broken and uplifted in equal measure. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published news stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Elijah Washington winced as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The 12-year-old boy had been standing for nearly an hour at the back of his math classroom, his notebook balanced carefully against the wall. His classmates occasionally shot curious glances his way, but most had grown accustomed to his peculiar habit of never sitting down during lessons. "Elijah, there's an empty seat right there," Mrs. Patterson said, gesturing toward a desk in the front row. Her voice was kind but tinged with exasperation. It was the third time this week she tried to coax him into sitting down. "I'm okay standing, ma'am," Elijah replied softly, his eyes fixed on the complex equations she'd written on the board. "I can see better from here." What he didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to explain again, was that sitting caused him excruciating pain. The injury from last year, when Miss Harrington had struck him repeatedly with a ruler across his lower back for daring to correct her mathematical error in front of the class, had never properly healed. The doctor had explained something about deep tissue bruising and possible nerve damage, but all Elijah understood was that classroom chairs had become instruments of torture. At home that evening, Elijah sat on the special cushion his grandmother had sewn for him, filled with memory foam she'd sacrificed her own pillow to provide. "How was school today, my little genius?" Grandma Louisa asked, setting a plate of dinner before him. "Same as always," Elijah replied, diving into the numbers of his homework rather than elaborating. The advanced calculus problems from the high school textbook that Dr. Chen had given him were far more interesting than dwelling on his daily discomfort. Grandma Louisa watched him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. After Elijah's parents died in a car accident 3 years ago, she'd taken on raising her grandson with all the love and determination her aging body could muster. She'd recognized his extraordinary gift for mathematics early on, the way he'd count and categorize everything, the ease with which he grasped concepts that left adults bewildered. "Dr. Chen called today," she said casually, watching Elijah's face light up at the mention of the kind mathematics teacher who had taken special interest in her grandson's abilities. "He says you finished that college-level workbook he gave you last month." Elijah nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "It wasn't that hard once I understood the foundational principles." Grandma Louisa chuckled. "You know, when I was your age, I was still struggling with my times tables." Later that night, as Elijah lay on his stomach, the only comfortable sleeping position since the incident, he heard his grandmother on the phone in the kitchen. "Yes, it's still bothering him. No, he won't tell the new teachers why he stands. The shame of it, Mr. Chen, it cuts deeper than the physical pain. That woman had no right to put her hands on my boy, genius or not." Elijah pulled his pillow over his head, not wanting to hear more. The equations in his mind were safer, more predictable. Numbers didn't hurt you for being right when they were wrong. Numbers didn't punish you for seeing patterns they couldn't see. In the world of mathematics, Elijah had found the one place where his brilliance was an unequivocal asset rather than something that made others uncomfortable. As he drifted off to sleep, complex topological equations danced behind his eyelids, offering refuge from a world that too often punished difference and excellence in the same cruel stroke. Dr. Marcus Chen stood before the faculty committee with uncharacteristic nervousness. The 50-something mathematics professor adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking. "I understand bringing a child to the Whitfield Symposium is unprecedented," he said, "but I assure you, Elijah Washington is equally unprecedented. His solutions to the Hamilton-Jacobi equations alone would qualify as graduate-level work. Professor Diana Winters, head of the mathematics department at Easton High where Dr. Chen taught advanced courses, looked skeptical. "Marcus, we all appreciate your community outreach efforts, but Harvard University isn't a field trip destination." "This isn't about community outreach," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "This is about mathematics. Elijah solved problems in minutes that took me hours to work through. His intuitive understanding of topological persistence is something I've never encountered in 30 years of teaching." After much debate, the committee reluctantly agreed. Dr. Chen immediately drove to the modest apartment complex where Elijah lived with his grandmother. "Harvard University?" Grandma Louisa repeated, eyes wide with disbelief. "My Elijah?" The symposium features Professor Richard Whitfield himself presenting his work on topological data analysis, Dr. Chen explained excitedly. "It's exactly the field Elijah has shown such aptitude for." Elijah, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, stepped forward. Will I have to sit for a long time?" he asked, his brilliant mind immediately calculating the practical concerns. Dr. Chen's expression softened. "I've arranged for a special standing desk at the back of the lecture hall. No one will think anything of it, many mathematicians prefer to stand while working." That night, after Dr. Chen left, Grandma Louisa sat beside Elijah on his bed, carefully avoiding putting pressure on his sensitive back. "Baby, are you sure you want to do this? Those university types can be..." She trailed off, not wanting to plant seeds of doubt. "Judgmental?" Elijah offered. "Like Ms. Harrington?" Grandma Louisa nodded sadly. "Dr. Chen won't let anything bad happen," Elijah said with more confidence than he felt. "And I really want to hear Professor Whitfield's lecture. His paper on persistent homology frameworks was..." He stopped, noting his grandmother's loving but bewildered expression. "It was really good, Grandma." The week before the symposium passed in a blur of preparation. Dr. Chen brought Elijah additional papers to review and spent evenings discussing concepts that most mathematics professors would find challenging. For his part, Elijah absorbed everything with remarkable speed, asking questions that repeatedly left Dr. Chen reaching for reference materials. The night before the symposium, Elijah couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking up at the stars, thinking about the next day. Part of him was terrified. The memory of Ms. Harrington's ridicule before she'd resorted to physical punishment was still fresh. The prestigious halls of Harvard seemed like a place where he would be even more out of place, a young black boy from a struggling neighborhood among the academic elite. But another part of him, the part that came alive when immersed in the elegant language of mathematics, was desperate to attend, to hear new ideas, to see how far his understanding could stretch. "Mathematics doesn't care who solves its puzzles," his father had told him once. "It only cares that they're solved correctly." With that thought comforting him, Elijah finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of equations that blossomed like flowers across chalkboards that stretched to infinity. The imposing red brick buildings of Harvard University loomed before Elijah as he stepped out of Dr. Chen's modest sedan. Students bustled past, carrying expensive laptops and chattering about research grants and summer internships at prestigious firms. Elijah clutched his worn notebook tighter against his chest, suddenly acutely aware of his second-hand clothes and scuffed sneakers. "Impressive, isn't it?" Dr. Chen said, mistaking Elijah's wide-eyed stare for admiration rather than intimidation. "The Department of Mathematics is in the Science Center. Professor Whitfield's lecture will be in Pierce Hall." As they walked across Harvard Yard, Elijah tried to ignore the curious and sometimes dismissive glances from passing students and faculty. A group of graduate students in particular eyed him with undisguised bewilderment, whispering among themselves. "Is it, bring your child to work, day?" one murmured just loudly enough to be heard. "More diversity outreach, probably," another replied with a smirk. Dr. Chen, walking slightly ahead, didn't notice the exchange, but Elijah's shoulders hunched slightly as the familiar weight of others' assumptions settled upon them. The interior of Pierce Hall was even more intimidating, all polished wood and gleaming brass, with portraits of stern-faced mathematicians lining the walls. Their pale faces seemed to follow Elijah with disapproving eyes as he trailed behind Dr. Chen toward the lecture hall. "Dr. Chen. I wasn't sure you'd make it," called a friendly voice. A woman with warm brown skin and a halo of natural curls approached them, hand extended. "And who's this young man?" "Professor Gonzalez," Dr. Chen greeted her warmly. "This is Elijah Washington, the student I told you about." "Elijah, this is Professor Maria Gonzalez, an expert in computational topology." Professor Gonzalez knelt slightly to meet Elijah at eye level, showing none of the condescension adults often displayed when addressing children. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Elijah. Marcus has told me about your extraordinary work with persistent homology." Before Elijah could respond, the lecture hall doors burst open, and a tall, silver-haired man emerged, surrounded by a group of eager graduate students hanging on his every word. His tailored suit and commanding presence immediately identified him as someone of importance. "Ah, here comes the man himself," Professor Gonzalez said, her tone shifting subtly. "Professor Richard Whitfield." Whitfield was in the middle of explaining something, gesturing emphatically. "Which is why the traditional approach has consistently failed. My framework provides the first viable pathway to—" He stopped abruptly as he noticed their small group, his gaze lingering on Elijah with obvious surprise and confusion. "Marcus," Whitfield acknowledged Dr. Chen with a curt nod. "Maria. I wasn't aware today's lecture was open to the general public." His emphasis made it clear he was referring to Elijah's presence. "Richard, this is Elijah Washington," Dr. Chen said. "The student I mentioned in my email about the symposium." Whitfield's eyebrows rose. "You were serious about that? I assumed it was some sort of joke." A young black woman stepped forward from the group of graduate students. "Professor, we should head inside. It's almost time to begin." "Yes, thank you, Aisha," Whitfield replied, barely glancing at her before returning his attention to Elijah. "Well, young man, I hope you can follow along. We'll be discussing some rather advanced concepts today." His tone made it clear he thought this impossible. As they entered the lecture hall, Dr. Chen guided Elijah toward the back where, true to his word, a standing desk had been arranged. Elijah felt a momentary rush of gratitude toward his mentor for remembering his needs. "Don't let Whitfield intimidate you," Dr. Chen whispered. "Brilliant mathematician, but his people's skills leave much to be desired." The lecture hall filled quickly. Elijah noticed the young woman Whitfield had called Aisha take a seat nearby. She offered him a small, encouraging smile before turning her attention to her notebook. As Professor Whitfield began his presentation, his earlier dismissiveness transformed into evident passion for his subject. Despite the man's arrogance, Elijah found himself drawn into the elegant mathematics being displayed on the massive screens. Whitfield was working on exactly the areas that fascinated Elijah most, the application of algebraic topology to complex data analysis. But when Whitfield presented a particularly challenging equation, one he claimed had stumped mathematicians for years and that he was on the verge of solving, Elijah felt a familiar tingle at the base of his skull. The same feeling he got when he could see a mathematical pattern crystallizing before others even recognized its existence. Staring at the equation, standing quietly at his desk at the back of the hall, Elijah began to see a solution approach that Professor Whitfield had apparently overlooked. His pencil moved almost unconsciously across his notebook page, exploring the possibility that was unfolding in his mind with perfect clarity. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice Professor Whitfield's growing frustration as the renowned mathematician attempted to explain his approach to the problem, an approach that Elijah could already see was leading toward a dead end. "And here," Professor Whitfield announced with theatrical flourish, "we encounter what I've come to call the Whitfield boundary conjecture." The equation sprawled across 3 screens, a monstrous configuration of symbols that caused several graduate students to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Whitfield paced before it like a general surveying a battlefield. "For the past 18 months, I've been developing a novel approach to this topological invariant," he continued. "The implications for data science and quantum physics are, quite frankly, revolutionary." From his standing desk, Elijah studied the equation with growing excitement. What Whitfield was attempting was indeed groundbreaking, if it could be solved. But something about the professor's approach struck Elijah as unnecessarily complicated, like trying to cross a river by building a bridge when there was a perfectly good boat nearby. The difficulty, Whitfield explained, lies in reconciling these persistent homology groups with the underlying manifold structure when dimensions exceed 4. He gestured to a particularly dense cluster of notation. My team and I have made significant progress, but certain pathological cases remain resistant to our analysis. Aisha Johnson, the graduate student who had smiled at Elijah earlier, raised her hand. Professor, have you considered applying the recent results from Wang's paper on stratified spaces? It might provide an alternative framework for. I'm well acquainted with Wang's work, Ms. Johnson, Whitfield interrupted, his tone dismissive. It's an interesting approach for simpler cases, but utterly inadequate for the complexity we're addressing here. Aisha's expression remained professional, but Elijah noticed her jaw tighten slightly as she made a note in her book. Whitfield continued for another 20 minutes, growing increasingly animated as he detailed his approach. Occasionally, he would pose questions to the audience, but his reactions to their responses made it clear he viewed them more as opportunities to showcase his own brilliance than genuine inquiries. Meanwhile, Elijah had filled several pages with his own explorations. Dr. Chen, noticing his intense concentration, quietly moved closer to observe his work. As the older mathematician peered over Elijah's shoulder, his eyes widened progressively. Elijah, he whispered, are you seeing what I think you're seeing? Elijah nodded without looking up, his pencil still moving rapidly across the page. The problem isn't with the persistent homology groups themselves, he whispered back. It's with the assumption that the filtration has to follow the conventional progression. If you allow for a non-uniform filtration based on the intrinsic geometry rather than imposed metrics. Dr. Chen's sharp intake of breath caused a few nearby attendees to glance their way. Whitfield, noticing the disturbance, paused mid-sentence. Is there something you'd like to share with the group, Dr. Chen? He asked, irritation evident in his voice. No, please continue, Richard, Dr. Chen replied smoothly. We're just following along with great interest. Whitfield narrowed his eyes but resumed his lecture. As he approached what he described as the current frontier of our understanding, he invited several of his graduate students to present their attempts at advancing the solution. One by one, they approached the podium, explaining increasingly complex approaches that ultimately led to the same mathematical dead ends. After the third such presentation, Whitfield sighed dramatically. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where we stand. The complete solution remains elusive, though I expect a breakthrough within the next few months. During the short break that followed, Elijah continued working, barely aware of the people filing past him toward the refreshment table. His mind was entirely consumed by the mathematical puzzle, which had clarified itself in his understanding to reveal a surprisingly elegant solution path. You've been working on that non-stop, came a voice beside him. It was Aisha Johnson. Most kids your age would be playing on their phone by now. Elijah looked up, momentarily disoriented as he transitioned from the abstract world of mathematics back to the lecture hall. It's more interesting than any game, he said simply. Aisha smiled. I felt the same way at your age. That's why I'm here now. She glanced down at his notebook, curious. What are you working on so intensely? Before Elijah could decide how much to share, Dr. Chen returned with a cup of water for him. Staying hydrated helps mathematical thinking, he said with a wink, positioning himself subtly between Elijah's work and Aisha's view. Aisha raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Well, good luck with your work, she said to Elijah. Maybe I'll see you at a conference presenting your own research someday. As she walked away, Dr. Chen leaned closer to Elijah. How much further have you gotten? He asked quietly. I think I've solved it, Elijah replied, equally quiet. But there's a part one need to verify. During the break, the lecture hall thinned out as attendees migrated toward the refreshment tables in the adjacent room. Elijah remained at his standing desk, completely absorbed in his work, the sounds of academic small talk fading into white noise around him. Dr. Chen had gone to speak with Professor Gonzalez, leaving Elijah momentarily alone with his calculations. His pencil moved confidently across the page, each symbol placed with deliberate precision. The solution that had begun as an intuitive flash was now taking rigorous form under his methodical approach. Still at it, I see, Aisha Johnson had returned, 2 cookies balanced on a napkin. She offered one to Elijah. Brain fuel. Elijah accepted it with a small smile of thanks, continuing to work as he nibbled on the cookie. You know, Aisha said, glancing at his notebook, when I was about your age, I used to drive my teachers crazy correcting their work. She laughed softly. Didn't make me very popular. Elijah's pencil paused momentarily. Did they ever? He began, then stopped himself. Did they ever what? Aisha prompted gently. Elijah shook his head and returned to his work. Nothing. Aisha studied him for a moment, then her eyes widened slightly as she caught a glimpse of his calculations. Wait, are you working on Whitfield's boundary problem? She leaned closer. That's not the approach he was describing. It's simpler this way, Elijah said quietly, instinctively shifting his notebook to shield it from view, a habit developed from years of classmates attempting to copy his work. Before Aisha could respond, a commotion near the lecture hall entrance drew their attention. Professor Whitfield had returned, surrounded by several senior faculty members. His voice carried across the room, loud and irritated. Completely stalled our progress for weeks. If Bradford's team had shared their data sets as agreed, we'd have verified the solution by now. As the group moved toward the podium, Whitfield's frustration was evident in every gesture. The break was ending, and attendees began filtering back into their seats. Dr. Chen returned to Elijah's side. How's it coming along? He asked quietly. I've verified it, Elijah replied. The solution works across all the test cases. Dr. Chen's eyes widened. You're certain? Elijah nodded, an unusual confidence in his expression. The second half of the lecture began with Whitfield introducing what he called pathological edge cases that had resisted his team's analysis. With each example, Elijah checked his approach against the new constraints, finding that his solution accommodated them all. The fundamental challenge, Whitfield was saying, his earlier confidence now tinged with audible frustration, lies in reconciling the local and global topological properties within a unified framework. From her seat near Elijah, Aisha watched the young boy working steadily, his expression one of deep concentration rather than the confusion displayed on many graduate students' faces. Her curiosity piqued, she wrote a note on her pad and subtly passed it to him. Have you found something? Elijah read the note, hesitated, then wrote back, yes, but... He didn't complete the thought. Aisha understood immediately. She'd been in similar situations herself, having insights but hesitating to share them in environments where she already felt like an outsider. She wrote again, sometimes the youngest voices have the clearest perspective. Meanwhile, Whitfield's frustration was mounting as he worked through a particularly troublesome example, his elegant framework beginning to buckle under the strain of contradictory constraints. As you can see, he said, his voice tight, traditional approaches fail here. My framework provides the closest approximation, but even it requires additional refinement to fully resolve this case. Elijah looked down at his completed solution, then at Whitfield's struggling demonstration, then back at his notebook. The simple elegance of what he'd discovered contrasted sharply with the increasingly complicated patches Whitfield was applying to save his approach. Dr. Chen leaned close to Elijah's ear. It's your choice, he whispered. No one would blame you for staying quiet. Elijah thought of all the times he'd stayed quiet before, in Ms. Harrington's class until the day he couldn't bear to see her teach the wrong method anymore, in subsequent classes where he'd learned that correcting teachers rarely ended well for him. As Whitfield opened the floor for questions, several hands went up, but the professor called primarily on senior faculty or his own graduate students, bypassing others including Aisha. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as he considered what to do. The simple, beautiful solution in his notebook seemed to pulse with its own life, demanding to be shared. Yet years of painful experience held him back. The tension in Pierce Hall was palpable as Professor Whitfield concluded his explanation of the latest failed approach. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and his earlier confidence had transformed into barely concealed frustration. Several graduate students exchanged uncomfortable glances, while visiting faculty shifted in their seats. "Perhaps," Whitfield said, his voice strained, "we should consider this from another angle." He erased a section of his work and began rewriting, only to stop mid-equation, frowning at the result. In the silence that followed, Dr. Chen gave Elijah a questioning look. The boy's completed solution lay before him, verified and elegant in its simplicity. Elijah stared at his notebook, his mind racing through the potential consequences of speaking up. At this point, Whitfield said with forced lightness, "I'd welcome fresh perspectives. The conventional approaches have proven inadequate." His gaze swept the room, passing over Elijah without pause. "Anyone care to suggest an alternative framework?" Several hands rose tentatively, but Whitfield's dismissive responses to the first few brave souls quickly discouraged others. One by one, hands lowered until the room fell silent again. Aisha Johnson raised her hand persistently until Whitfield, with evident reluctance, acknowledged her. "Professor, perhaps we're overlooking something fundamental by adhering too rigidly to established filtration techniques," she suggested carefully. Whitfield's eyebrow arched. "A charming notion, Ms. Johnson, but mathematical breakthroughs rarely come from abandoning proven methodologies. Unless you have a specific alternative to propose." Aisha opened her mouth to continue but hesitated, her proposed approach still half-formed. It was at this precise moment that Elijah, almost without conscious decision, slowly raised his hand. The movement caught Whitfield's attention, and for a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his face before settling into amused condescension. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience as heads turned toward the back of the hall. "Well," Whitfield said, his tone mockingly indulgent, "our young visitor has something to contribute. This should be entertaining." He gestured dramatically. "Please, enlighten us." Dr. Chen placed a supportive hand on Elijah's shoulder as the boy cleared his throat. "Sir," Elijah began, his voice initially so soft that Whitfield had to lean forward, "I think the problem isn't with the persistent homology itself." "Is that so?" Whitfield replied, making no effort to hide his patronizing smile. "And what, in your extensive mathematical experience, do you believe the problem is?" A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. Professor Gonzalez frowned disapprovingly at Whitfield, while Aisha watched Elijah with keen interest. Instead of answering immediately, Elijah turned to a fresh page in his notebook and began writing, his pencil moving with surprising speed and confidence. "I'm waiting, young man," Whitfield prompted impatiently. "The issue," Elijah continued, his voice gaining strength, "is that you're assuming the filtration must follow a uniform progression based on external metrics." The room fell completely silent. Even those who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence, surprised by the unexpected technical terminology from the young boy. "If instead," Elijah continued, "you allow for a non-uniform filtration based on the intrinsic geometry of the underlying space, the persistent homology groups resolve naturally without forcing additional constraints." Whitfield's condescending smile faltered slightly. "That's an interesting hypothesis, but it fails to address the fundamental issue of dimension reduction in complex manifolds." "Actually, sir," Elijah responded, "it does address it." He held up his notebook, displaying a page of dense calculations. "If I could show you," Whitfield's expression hardened. "This is hardly the place for a child's mathematical fantasies. Dr. Chen, I'm surprised you would coach your student to disrupt serious academic discourse with such." "I didn't coach him," Dr. Chen interrupted firmly. "Elijah developed this approach independently while listening to your lecture." "Preposterous," Whitfield scoffed. "Even my graduate students require months to develop meaningful insights into these problems." Professor Gonzalez stood up. "Richard, perhaps we should hear the boy out. What harm could it do?" Whitfield's face flushed slightly. "The harm, Maria, is to the integrity of this symposium. We're here to discuss advanced mathematics, not indulge in." "Please," Elijah's voice cut through the tension, surprisingly steady now. Just let me show you. Something in his tone, an unshakable certainty beyond his years, caused Whitfield to pause. After a moment of hesitation, he gestured impatiently toward the podium. Very well. You have 3 minutes to present this alternative approach. Dr. Chen, please assist your student. But Elijah was already moving toward the front of the room, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. Dr. Chen followed closely behind, concern evident on his face. As Elijah approached the podium, the full attention of the lecture hall focused on him. Some faces showed amusement, others curiosity, and a few, including Aisha and Professor Gonzalez, displayed genuine interest. The podium was too high for Elijah to use comfortably, so he simply stood before it. Dr. Chen offered to hold his notebook up, but Elijah shook his head slightly. May I use the digital board? He asked Whitfield, pointing to the interactive display that had been used throughout the lecture. Whitfield looked momentarily taken aback by the request but nodded curtly. With surprising composure, Elijah approached the board and began to write. His small hand moved confidently, starting with Whitfield's original equation but quickly transforming it through a series of elegant manipulations. His writing was neat and precise, each symbol placed with careful intent. The room watched in growing astonishment as the 12-year-old filled the board with advanced mathematics. Even Whitfield's dismissive expression gradually gave way to grudging attention as the approach unfolded before him. As you can see, Elijah explained, his voice growing more confident with each word, by relaxing the constraint on uniform filtration and instead allowing the filtration to adapt to the intrinsic geometry, we can resolve the apparent contradictions in the boundary cases. He turned to face the audience, many of whom were now leaning forward in their seats, expressions ranging from skepticism to amazement. The key insight, Elijah continued, is that the topological features we're trying to capture aren't uniformly distributed across the parameter space. By allowing for a variable rate of filtration, proportional to the local complexity of the structure, we preserve the essential relationships while avoiding the pathological edge cases. The silence that followed Elijah's explanation lasted only moments before Professor Whitfield cleared his throat loudly. An interesting approach, he said, his voice tight with restrained irritation. However, I'm afraid it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the established frameworks in topological data analysis. Elijah blinked, momentarily confused. His solution worked, he'd verified it against all the test cases Whitfield had presented. But sir, he began, if you look at the third transformation, you can see that. What I can see, Whitfield interrupted, his voice rising, is that Dr. Chen has coached you very effectively on presenting a simplified version of existing methodologies. He turned to address the audience. While I appreciate the theatrical element this adds to our symposium, I think we should return to serious academic discourse. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably. Aisha Johnson stood up from her seat. Professor Whitfield, she said firmly, I've been studying your framework for 2 years, and what Elijah just presented is not a simplified version of existing methods. It's a novel approach that deserves proper consideration. Whitfield's face flushed. Ms. Johnson, your enthusiasm for defending the child is admirable but misplaced. There are fundamental flaws in this approach that would become apparent with more rigorous analysis. What flaws specifically? Professor Gonzalez called out from her seat. The transformations appear valid to me. Whitfield turned back to the board, scanning Elijah's work with narrowed eyes. For starters, this variable filtration rate introduces computational complexities that would render practical applications impossible. Elijah, still standing by the board, shook his head. No, sir, it actually reduces computational complexity by eliminating the need for the additional constraints in your approach. The adaptive filtration naturally accommodates the varying density of topological features. Murmurs spread through the audience as several mathematicians began examining the work more closely, some taking photographs with their phones. Whitfield's expression darkened further. This is absurd. I've been working on this problem for 18 months with a team of qualified mathematicians. The notion that a child could waltz in and solve it in an afternoon is not just implausible, it's offensive. Dr. Chen stepped forward. Richard, mathematics doesn't care about credentials or age. It only cares about correct proofs. And Elijah's approach appears to be correct. Appears to be, Whitfield seized on the words. Exactly. A superficial resemblance to correctness is not the same as a rigorous proof. He turned to Elijah. Young man, can you provide the complete proof for global convergence of your approach across all possible manifold types? Elijah hesitated. I would need to write out the full derivation, but the core principles. As I suspected, Whitfield interrupted triumphantly. A clever heuristic, perhaps, but not a mathematically sound solution. Aisha had moved closer to the board and was studying Elijah's work intently. Actually, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I believe the convergence follows directly from his third transformation. She quickly wrote additional equations extending Elijah's work. The proof structure would be analogous to Chen's theorem on persistent homology convergence, but with the modified filtration rate. Whitfield's confidence wavered visibly as other mathematicians began nodding in agreement with Aisha's assessment. Even if, and this is a substantial if, the approach has merit, Whitfield said, shifting tactics, it's clearly derivative of established methods. I find it difficult to believe that a child with no formal training in advanced topology could independently develop such an approach. He looked directly at Dr. Chen. Unless, of course, he had significant assistance. The accusation hung in the air. Dr. Chen's expression hardened, but before he could respond, Elijah spoke up. Sir, I just saw it differently, he said simply. When you showed the equation, it reminded me of wave propagation in non-uniform media. The mathematics looked similar to problems I've worked on before. Problems you've worked on before? Whitfield repeated incredulously. What problems, exactly, would those be? Middle school algebra. Several audience members frowned at Whitfield's increasingly hostile tone. Professor Gonzalez had joined Aisha at the board and was examining the work closely. Richard, she said without looking up, I think you need to consider the possibility that we're witnessing something extraordinary here. This approach resolves the contradictions we've been struggling with for months. Whitfield's face had become a rigid mask. What we're witnessing, he said coldly, is the unfortunate consequence of allowing unprepared visitors into serious academic settings. It creates disruption rather than genuine contribution. Elijah stood silently by the board, his initial confidence giving way to the familiar feeling of being dismissed and diminished. Despite the supportive presence of Dr. Chen, Aisha, and Professor Gonzalez, the weight of Whitfield's rejection pressed heavily on his shoulders. As whispers rippled through the audience, Elijah remained beside the board, his solution displayed for all to see. Despite Professor Whitfield's dismissals, several mathematicians were now engaged in intense discussions, pointing at specific parts of Elijah's work. Richard, Professor Gonzalez said firmly, regardless of where this solution came from, it needs to be properly evaluated. The approach is novel and addresses the key issues we've been struggling with. Whitfield's jaw tightened. I'm not opposed to evaluation, Maria. What I object to is turning a serious academic symposium into some sort of inspirational movie moment where a child magically solves what experts cannot. He gestured dismissively toward Elijah. If he wants to submit his work through proper channels, he's welcome to do so like anyone else. Aisha stepped closer to Elijah. Are you okay? She asked quietly, noting his rigid posture and the tension in his face. Elijah nodded slightly, though his hands had begun to tremble. Standing this long without support was aggravating his back injury, sending waves of pain through his lower spine. Still, he refused to show weakness, especially now. Perhaps, Dr. Chen suggested, we could provide Elijah with a chair while we discuss the mathematical merits of his approach. I prefer to stand, Elijah said quickly, too quickly. Whitfield raised an eyebrow. Pride comes before a fall, young man. There's no shame in admitting when you're out of your depth. It's not pride, Dr. Chen interjected, his normally calm voice edged with rare anger. Elijah cannot sit comfortably due to an injury. The statement caused another ripple of whispers. Whitfield frowned, momentarily thrown off his dismissive stance. An injury? Professor Gonzalez asked, concern evident in her voice. Dr. Chen looked at Elijah, silently asking permission. After a moment's hesitation, Elijah gave a small nod. Last year, Dr. Chen explained, his voice controlled but tight with emotion. Elijah corrected a mathematical error made by his elementary school teacher, Ms. Harrington. She responded by striking him repeatedly across his lower back with a wooden ruler, causing nerve damage that makes sitting extremely painful for him. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Aisha's eyes widened, and several audience members gasped audibly. Even Whitfield seemed momentarily speechless. That's why he always stands during lectures, Dr. Chen continued. Not out of disrespect or inability to focus, but because sitting causes him physical pain. Pain he endured for having the courage to speak up when he saw something incorrect. Elijah stared at the floor, uncomfortable with the attention shifting from his mathematics to his personal story. This was exactly what he'd wanted to avoid, being seen as an object of pity rather than a mathematician with valid ideas. I have a cushion you could use, a graduate student offered, standing up with a padded laptop case. It might help. My office is just down the hall, Professor Gonzalez added. I have an ergonomic stool that might be more comfortable. Elijah shook his head. Thank you, but I'm fine standing. Can we please go back to discussing the solution? His quiet determination shifted the atmosphere in the room. Even those who had been skeptical of his mathematical abilities were now watching with newfound respect. Whitfield cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with this unexpected development. While that story is regrettable, he said, choosing his words carefully, it doesn't change the mathematical evaluation at hand. You're right, Elijah replied, straightening despite his pain. It doesn't change the mathematics. My solution works regardless of who I am or why I'm standing. The simple dignity in his response seemed to affect even Whitfield, whose expression softened slightly. Very well, the professor said after a moment. Let's examine your approach more systematically. He turned to the board and pointed to a specific transformation. This step, moving from a uniform to an adaptive filtration, requires justification. How do you determine the optimal local filtration rate? It was a genuine mathematical question, free from the earlier condescension. Elijah recognized it as such and responded in kind. The optimal rate, he explained, turning to the board and adding another equation, is determined by the local curvature of the data manifold, which can be estimated using this differential operator. His hand moved confidently as he wrote out the formula. In regions of high curvature, where topological features are densely packed, the filtration proceeds more slowly, allowing finer resolution of features. Whitfield studied the new equation carefully. That addresses the rate determination, but what about convergence guarantees? How do we know this adaptive approach will capture all relevant topological features? Instead of becoming defensive, Elijah welcomed the rigorous questioning. This was mathematics as it should be, ideas evaluated on their merits, without regard for the status or background of who proposed them. The convergence guarantees come from this inequality, Elijah said, adding another line to his work. As long as the minimum filtration rate exceeds this bound, we can prove that no topological feature will be missed. As Elijah continued explaining his approach, responding to increasingly technical questions from Whitfield and others, the dynamic in the room shifted perceptibly. What had begun as a confrontation was transforming into a collaborative mathematical discussion. Even Whitfield, despite his initial hostility, was engaging with the ideas themselves rather than dismissing them based on their source. Throughout this exchange, Elijah remained standing, the pain in his back a constant reminder of the price he had paid for speaking mathematical truth in the past. But here, in this moment, his voice was being heard and his ideas evaluated fairly, perhaps for the first time in his young life. The atmosphere in Pierce Hall had transformed. What began as a standard academic lecture had evolved into something extraordinary, a collaborative exploration centered around the insights of a 12-year-old boy who refused to sit down, both literally and figuratively. Professor Whitfield, despite his initial dismissiveness, was now fully engaged with Elijah's approach, his professional curiosity gradually overcoming his pride. He pointed to a specific equation on the board. This adaptive filtration rate, he said, his tone now that of a colleague rather than an adversary, effectively resolves the boundary inconsistencies my team has been struggling with for months. He shook his head slightly, as if still trying to reconcile this reality with his preconceptions. But the computational complexity is actually reduced. Elijah completed the thought, adding another line of calculations to the board. Because we no longer need the compensatory constraints in the original approach, the overall algorithm becomes more efficient, not less. Aisha, who had been running simulations on her laptop based on Elijah's approach, looked up with an expression of amazement. "He's right," she announced to the room. "I've implemented a basic version of his method against the test cases from our lab. It not only converges in all instances but does so with approximately 40% fewer computational steps." A murmur of impressed voices rippled through the audience. Several senior mathematicians had moved to the front rows, taking detailed notes as the discussion unfolded. Professor Gonzalez, who had been quietly analyzing the complete approach, spoke up. "The elegance of this solution lies in its fundamental insight, that the mathematical structure itself should dictate the analysis approach, not our predetermined methodologies." She looked at Elijah with undisguised admiration. It's the kind of perspective shift that often eludes those of us who have been in the field for decades. Whitfield walked slowly along the board, examining the full derivation that now covered its entire surface. His expression was complex, a mixture of scientific appreciation and personal reckoning. "The implications," he said almost to himself, "extend far beyond this specific problem." He turned to face Elijah directly. This adaptive framework could potentially be applied to a whole class of topological analysis challenges we've been approaching incorrectly. Dr. Chen, who had been watching this transformation with quiet satisfaction, placed a supportive hand on Elijah's shoulder. The boy was beginning to show signs of physical fatigue, though his mental engagement remained razor-sharp. "Perhaps," Dr. Chen suggested gently, "we should document this breakthrough properly. Elijah has been standing for nearly 3 hours now." Whitfield looked at Elijah with newfound awareness, noticing for the first time the strain in the boy's posture despite his focused expression. "Yes, of course," he agreed quickly. "Ms. Johnson, would you please ensure that everything on the board is photographed and transcribed?" Aisha immediately began taking high-resolution photographs from multiple angles. Other graduate students joined her, ensuring that no detail of Elijah's solution would be lost. "Young man," Whitfield said, addressing Elijah directly, "I owe you an apology." The word seemed difficult for him, but his voice was sincere. "I allowed preconceptions to cloud my scientific judgment, the very thing we as mathematicians are supposed to guard against." Elijah, unaccustomed to such acknowledgement from authority figures, especially after being initially dismissed, seemed unsure how to respond. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. A graduate student who had been verifying parts of the solution on his laptop stood up excitedly. "The adaptive filtration maintains topological consistency even in higher dimensional projections. This is revolutionary." As this proclamation sparked another round of animated discussions among the mathematicians, Elijah finally allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The equations on the board, his equations, represented not just a solution to a difficult mathematical problem, but a vindication of his voice and his perspective. Professor Gonzalez approached Elijah and Dr. Chen. "This breakthrough deserves wider recognition," she said. "With your permission, I'd like to contact colleagues at the International Mathematical Union about a special session at the next Congress." While the adults discussed next steps, Elijah's attention returned to the mathematics itself. He had spotted an additional implication of his approach, one that even the senior mathematicians hadn't yet recognized. Taking up a marker again, he added a final equation to the board, connecting his framework to an apparently unrelated area of geometric analysis. Whitfield noticed the addition and fell suddenly silent, studying it with intense concentration. After a long moment, his eyes widened in genuine astonishment. "This," he began, then stopped, collecting his thoughts. "This suggests a potential unification of persistent homology with Ricci flow analysis." He looked at Elijah with new eyes, not as a child prodigy or curiosity, but as a mathematical mind of rare insight. "Do you realize what you've just implied with this connection?" Elijah nodded, his voice quiet but confident. That topological features and geometric evolution share a fundamental mathematical structure that we've been analyzing separately, but could approach unified. The simplicity and profundity of the statement silenced the room. In that moment, everyone present, from first-year graduate students to renowned professors, recognized they were witnessing not just an impressive performance by a gifted child, but a genuine mathematical breakthrough that would likely appear in textbooks for generations to come. And at the center of it all stood Elijah Washington, a 12-year-old boy who couldn't sit down because an elementary school teacher had punished him for being right when she was wrong, a boy whose perspective had remained undiminished despite the world's persistent attempts to diminish it. The symposium had officially ended 30 minutes ago, yet nobody had left Pierce Hall. Small clusters of mathematicians gathered around laptops and tablets, testing Elijah's approach against various data sets, their excited exclamations confirming success after success. Others huddled near the board, photographing and discussing the implications of what many were already calling the Washington Framework. Professor Whitfield stood slightly apart, watching this activity with a complex expression. The afternoon had forced a profound reckoning, not just with his mathematical assumptions, but with deeper biases he had never fully acknowledged to himself. His framework, the culmination of 18 months of work and the centerpiece of his professional identity, had been elegantly superseded by a child he had initially dismissed without consideration. Across the room, Dr. Chen had finally convinced Elijah to rest, improvising a comfortable arrangement by padding a counter-height lab stool with several cushions borrowed from the faculty lounge. The boy alternated between standing and perching on this makeshift support, clearly exhausted but still engaged with the discussions swirling around him. Whitfield took a deep breath and approached them. "Dr. Chen," he said formally, "I wonder if I might have a private word with Elijah." Dr. Chen looked to Elijah, who nodded his assent. "I'll be just over there with Professor Gonzalez," Dr. Chen said, squeezing Elijah's shoulder reassuringly before stepping away. For a moment, the renowned mathematician and the young boy regarded each other in silence. Then Whitfield pulled up a chair and sat, deliberately positioning himself lower than Elijah on his stool, a subtle but meaningful reversal of their earlier power dynamic. "I've spent my entire career in mathematics," Whitfield began, his voice quieter and more reflective than Elijah had heard it before. 37 years dedicated to pursuing mathematical truth. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "And yet today, I allowed non-mathematical factors to influence my evaluation of a beautiful solution." Elijah remained silent, unsure where this was heading. "May I ask you something, Elijah?" Whitfield continued. "When you first saw the problem on the board, what did you see that the rest of us missed?" Elijah considered the question seriously. "I didn't think about what everyone else had tried," he said finally. "I just looked at what the mathematics itself was showing me." Whitfield nodded slowly. "Unburdened by established approaches." "I guess so," Elijah agreed. "When you showed the equation, it reminded me of patterns I'd noticed in other problems. The mathematics seemed to want to flow in a certain direction, but your framework was trying to channel it differently." "The mathematics wanted to flow," Whitfield repeated softly, a smile touching his lips. "That's precisely it. The best mathematicians listen to what the mathematics wants, rather than imposing their will upon it." He shook his head ruefully. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped listening as carefully as I once did." Across the room, Aisha approached with a tablet displaying simulation results. "Professor Whitfield, Elijah's approach resolves the quantum data sets as well. The adaptive filtration maintains coherence across dimensional reduction without information loss." Her eyes shone with excitement. "This has implications far beyond topology." "Thank you, Ms. Johnson," Whitfield replied. "Please compile all test results for publication reference." As Aisha departed, he turned back to Elijah. "Your work today will help advance multiple fields of research. That's quite remarkable for an afternoon's contribution." Elijah shifted slightly on his stool, wincing as he adjusted his position. The movement didn't escape Whitfield's notice. "Your injury," he said carefully. "Dr. Chen mentioned it was caused by a teacher." Elijah nodded, his expression closing slightly. Ms. Harrington didn't like being corrected about the quadratic formula. And the school? Surely they said I should have raised my hand instead of speaking out of turn. Elijah completed the thought. Said I needed to respect authority even when. He trailed off. Even when authority is wrong, Whitfield finished quietly. A moment of understanding passed between them, the older mathematician recognizing in that moment how systems he had comfortably navigated his entire career could brutally punish those who didn't fit predetermined expectations. The silence was broken by Professor Gonzalez approaching with Dr. Chen. Richard, she said, the department chair is on her way over. News of Elijah's breakthrough has reached the dean's office. Whitfield stood, smoothing his jacket with an automatic gesture. Elijah should be the one to present the framework to her, he said decisively. It's his work, not mine. The statement, simple but profound in its implications, caused Dr. Chen to look at Whitfield with new respect. As they waited for the department chair to arrive, Whitfield turned once more to Elijah. Mathematics has always been my refuge, he said reflectively. A place where only the truth of the proof matters, not the person presenting it. He met Elijah's eyes directly. I failed to uphold that principle today, and in doing so, I nearly missed witnessing a beautiful mathematical insight. I won't make that mistake again. Elijah, overwhelmed by the events of the day and the unexpected vulnerability from the formerly intimidating professor, simply nodded. Perhaps, Whitfield continued more practically, when you're feeling recovered, you might consider allowing me to introduce you to some colleagues at the Institute for Advanced Study. They would be particularly interested in your perspective on several open problems in computational topology. Before Elijah could respond, the department chair arrived, accompanied by several senior faculty members. As introductions were made and the significance of the day's events explained, Elijah found himself at the center of academic attention that, for the first time in his life, recognized his mathematical voice without qualification or condition. Meanwhile, Whitfield stepped back, watching as the young boy explained his framework to the newcomers with growing confidence. In the renowned mathematician's expression was a complex mixture of professional admiration, personal regret, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a sense of liberation. For in witnessing Elijah's approach to mathematics, unburdened by tradition or expectation, Whitfield had been reminded of why he himself had fallen in love with the field so many years ago. Some victories in mathematics come from years of incremental progress. Others arrive in moments of unexpected clarity. Today had brought both a mathematical breakthrough and a more personal one, not just for Elijah Washington, but for Richard Whitfield as well. The morning after the symposium, Elijah sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, attempting to explain the events of the previous day. Grandma Louisa listened attentively, though the mathematical details sailed well over her head. So this Professor Whitfield, she said, focusing on what she could understand, he admitted he was wrong in front of everyone. Elijah nodded, spreading peanut butter on his toast. He said my approach was more elegant than his. And he's going to include me as co-author on the paper they're publishing. Grandma Louisa beamed with pride, though concern still shadowed her eyes. And how was your back, standing all that time? Dr. Chen arranged for a special stool, Elijah replied, not mentioning how the pain had intensified during the long drive home. Some discomforts were worth bearing. The doorbell rang, interrupting their breakfast. Grandma Louisa's eyebrows rose in surprise, they rarely received visitors, especially this early. When she opened the door, she found Dr. Chen standing there with Professor Gonzalez and, most surprisingly, Professor Whitfield himself. I apologize for the early intrusion, Mrs. Washington, Dr. Chen said, but some important developments have occurred overnight that couldn't wait. Elijah appeared behind his grandmother, curiosity overcoming his usual shyness. May we come in? Professor Gonzalez asked. We have something significant to discuss with Elijah and yourself. Once seated in the modest living room, Professor Whitfield took the lead, his demeanor markedly different from his initial arrogance at the symposium. Mrs. Washington, he began formally, your grandson's mathematical insight has created quite a stir in the academic community. After yesterday's presentation, I contacted several colleagues at major research institutions. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. The response has been unprecedented. Professor Gonzalez continued, her voice warm with excitement. 3 separate universities have expressed interest in creating special research opportunities for Elijah. And the International Mathematical Union is considering a special presentation at their next Congress. Grandma Louisa's hand went to her heart. All this from one afternoon. Mathematics can change in an afternoon, Whitfield replied simply. When someone sees what no one else has seen before. Dr. Chen opened his laptop, showing Elijah an email thread. The Berkeley Topology Group already implemented your adaptive filtration approach on their quantum dataset. The results confirmed everything we discussed yesterday, and revealed additional applications we hadn't even considered. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes scanning the technical details with intense interest. But that's not all we came to discuss, Professor Gonzalez said, turning to address Grandma Louisa directly. We've learned about the circumstances behind Elijah's injury, about Ms. Harrington and the school's failure to address the situation adequately. Grandma Louisa's expression hardened. That woman had no business being around children. And the principal talked to me like I was making a fuss over nothing. Whitfield cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Washington, I've taken the liberty of contacting the university's legal department. They believe there are grounds for a significant case against both the teacher and the school district for physical abuse and subsequent negligence. We don't have money for lawyers, Grandma Louisa said automatically. The university is prepared to provide legal representation pro bono, Whitfield responded. Not as charity, but because we have a vested interest in protecting mathematical talent like Elijah's. His expression grew more determined. What happened to him is not just a personal injustice, it's a threat to the future of American scientific advancement. As the adults discussed legal strategies and educational opportunities, Elijah slipped away to his room, returning with a worn notebook. He handed it silently to Professor Whitfield, who opened it with curiosity. Inside were pages of mathematical explorations, not just on topology, but on number theory, analysis, and several other advanced fields. Some dated back 3 years, when Elijah had been just 9 years old. May I? Whitfield asked, gesturing to turn the pages. Elijah nodded. As Whitfield examined the notebook, his expression transformed from curiosity to astonishment. He passed it wordlessly to Professor Gonzalez, whose reaction mirrored his own. Elijah, she said finally, how long have you been working on the Hodge conjecture? Elijah shrugged slightly. Since last summer. I didn't know what it was called until I found a paper online. I just noticed patterns in the algebraic cycles that seemed to suggest a possible approach. The 3 mathematicians exchanged significant glances, recognizing they were in the presence of mathematical talent that appeared perhaps once in a generation. Mrs. Washington, Whitfield said, his voice now carrying absolute conviction, I want to be completely transparent about what we're witnessing here. Your grandson's abilities aren't just remarkable, they're extraordinarily rare. The mathematical community has a responsibility to nurture this level of talent, and to ensure that what happened with Ms. Harrington never happens again. The conversation continued for hours, covering educational options, legal strategies, and research opportunities. Throughout, Elijah remained quiet but engaged, his eyes lighting up whenever the discussion turned to actual mathematics rather than the logistics surrounding his future. As the visitors were preparing to leave, Dr. Chen addressed Elijah directly. There's one more thing, he said, producing a small package from his briefcase. The department had this made for you overnight. Elijah unwrapped it to find a custom-designed standing desk, portable, adjustable, and elegantly constructed. Until your back heals properly, Dr. Chen explained, this should make it easier for you to work comfortably wherever you are. As Elijah examined the thoughtful gift, Professor Whitfield extended his hand formally. Elijah Washington, I came here today not just as a Harvard professor, but as a mathematician who recognizes a peer. The humility in his voice was genuine. I would be honored if you would consider collaborating with me on extending your framework to other domains of mathematical analysis. For the first time since the symposium began, Elijah's face broke into a full, unguarded smile as he shook the professor's hand. I'd like that, sir. After the visitors departed, Grandma Louisa sat beside Elijah on the couch, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of pride and vindication. "Your parents would be so proud," she said softly. "Your father always said you had a special way of seeing the world." Elijah leaned against her shoulder, emotionally and physically exhausted from the events of the past 24 hours. "I just see the patterns, Grandma. They've always been there." 3 months after the Harvard Symposium, Elijah Washington stood at a custom-designed standing desk in a bright, airy classroom at the Center for Mathematical Excellence, a special program hastily established through joint funding from Harvard University and the National Science Foundation. The program's creation had been accelerated specifically to accommodate Elijah and 3 other exceptionally gifted young mathematicians from diverse backgrounds who had been identified through a nationwide search. The classroom bore little resemblance to traditional educational settings. Instead of rows of identical desks facing forward, the space featured flexible workstations designed to accommodate different learning styles and physical needs. Elijah's station included his adjustable standing desk and a specialized stool designed by ergonomic experts to minimize stress on his still healing back. The adaptive filtration rate creates a natural correspondence between the topological features and the underlying geometric structure, Elijah explained to the small group gathered around his workstation. Though only 12, he spoke with the confidence of someone discussing deeply familiar territory. Among his audience was Professor Whitfield, whose transformation over the past months had been nearly as remarkable as the mathematical framework that catalyzed it. Gone was the arrogant academic who had initially dismissed Elijah's insights. In his place was a humbled mentor who had become one of the most vocal advocates for recognizing and nurturing mathematical talent in underrepresented communities. The Washington Framework, as it had come to be known in mathematical circles, had been published the previous month in the prestigious Journal of Topological Analysis, with Elijah listed as lead author, the youngest in the journal's history. The paper had already been cited in 27 subsequent publications, sparking a minor revolution in computational topology. As Elijah concluded his explanation, the classroom door opened quietly, and Grandma Louisa slipped in, accompanied by Aisha Johnson, who had recently been appointed as a program coordinator while continuing her doctoral studies. Grandma Louisa beamed with pride as she watched her grandson holding his own in conversation with established mathematicians. The legal case against Ms. Harrington and the school district had been settled out of court, a substantial settlement that had secured Grandma Louisa's retirement and established a trust for Elijah's future education. More significantly, the case had triggered a statewide review of policies regarding teacher conduct and the identification of exceptional academic abilities in disadvantaged schools. Ms. Harrington herself had been removed from the classroom and was now facing a review of her teaching credentials. The school principal who had dismissed Elijah's injury had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. After the informal presentation concluded, Professor Whitfield approached Elijah and Grandma Louisa. "We've received the final confirmation today," he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "Elijah has been invited to present at the International Congress of Mathematicians next year. It's the highest honor in the mathematical community." Grandma Louisa clasped her hands together. "Lord, I never thought I'd see the day." Aisha, who had become something of an older sister figure to Elijah, grinned widely. "And that's not all. Tell them about the foundation, Professor." Whitfield nodded. The Elijah Washington Foundation for Mathematical Excellence has received its official nonprofit status. Starting next month, we'll begin identifying mathematically gifted students from underserved communities across the country. He looked directly at Elijah. "Your experience has changed how we think about discovering and nurturing mathematical talent." As the adults continued discussing logistics, Elijah stepped away to the large windows overlooking the university campus. In the reflection, he could see his younger self, standing in the back of Ms. Harrington's classroom, afraid to sit down, afraid to speak up, yet unable to ignore the mathematical truths that appeared so clearly to him. That boy had carried 2 burdens, the physical pain of his injury and the heavier weight of having his voice silenced. Today, one of those burdens was healing, and the other had been lifted entirely. "Elijah?" Dr. Chen's voice drew him back to the present. "There's someone here I'd like you to meet." Turning, Elijah saw Dr. Chen standing with a young girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She clutched a notebook to her chest and regarded Elijah with a mixture of awe and recognition. "This is Zora," Dr. Chen explained. "She'll be joining the program next month. Like you, she sees mathematics in ways her teachers haven't been able to understand." Elijah extended his hand formally, the way Professor Whitfield had done to him 3 months earlier. "It's nice to meet you, Zora." The girl shook his hand solemnly. "I read about your framework," she said. "I have some questions about the non-uniform filtration approach." As Elijah began discussing mathematics with this new young voice, Professor Whitfield watched from across the room, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In witnessing the bridge being formed between these two brilliant young minds, both of which might have been lost to mathematics without intervention, he saw the truest validation of the transformation that had begun that day in Pierce Hall. For in mathematics, as in life, the most profound solutions often come not from those who have been taught the most, but from those who see with the freshest eyes, if only they are given the chance to be seen and heard in return. Dear friend, stories like Elijah's remind us that brilliance exists everywhere, but opportunity does not. Too often, exceptional minds are silenced by prejudice, physical punishment, or simple lack of recognition. Every child deserves to be seen, heard, and nurtured, regardless of their background or circumstances. When we fail to protect our most vulnerable minds, we don't just harm them, we deprive humanity of their potential contributions. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that challenges assumptions and celebrates overlooked brilliance. Together, we can create a world where no genius goes unrecognized and no voice remains unheard.